Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Social Audio Think Tank. Josh here from Melbourne, Australia. I'm here with Jackson Rogers from Oz Podcast. How you going, Jackson?
I'm going good, thanks, Josh.
Today's episode is called the Profan-isode. Yes, we are going there. We're talking profanity and podcasting, and my personal feelings on that particular subject will become quite apparent during this episode, and maybe it's probably not what you're thinking as the listener. How do you feel about these two things, Jackson? Do you feel that profanity really limits someone's audience potential? Because that gets thrown out there a lot, and I've got pretty strong feelings about that particular subject. And also, how do you feel about shows that don't use the explicit tag but actually do, on occasion or quite regularly, feature pretty heavy profanity? Does that worry you at all as a listener? Obviously, iTunes wouldn't like it. And if you're using profanity and your show is found out to be listing itself as clean or having no profanity, then obviously you're a bit silly and you might end up with no show in iTunes anymore. But does that worry you? So maybe just that second question first, because it's a little bit easier, and then we'll dig into our feelings on profanity in general.
Well, I probably went about a year, maybe a year and a half of recording films from the granny before I realised just how filthy it was. And I can't remember what kind of tags I was putting on the podcast, but I thought it was just, there was maybe a few bits here and there that might have been offensive, but it was nothing major. But then I realised, no, there's actually quite hairy compared to other podcasts. A lot of podcasts are relatively clean, but this one is, it's not every other word, but it's enough that it needs the explicit tag, I think. And
you weren't listening? You weren't listing that as explicit?
I can't remember if I was or I wasn't, but it wasn't something I thought about anyway, so possibly not.
So my personal opinion on that particular subject, because it's something that is kind of like the gateway to having more swearing, is if you're going to have swearing, at least make it explicit. I think it's just the best thing to do by your audience, full stop. Like particularly new listeners that might get into your show because of the description or the title of your show or whatever it happens to be, and then all of a sudden you're barraging someone with swear words, and maybe they've put it on in the car or whatever in front of their kids, or maybe they just don't. The subject you've chosen to talk about and swearing don't match up.
Yeah.
That I obviously believe that you should list things as explicit. And I know that when I first listed one of our episodes as explicit, I won't repeat the word. Jackson was a little bit confused about that until I reminded him of what one of the words was, particularly in the connotation of, the UK particularly.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good idea to do it even if you're using soft language. But, and this is getting to my main point of today, anyone who says that you're limiting your audience potential by having explicit language, basically, A, they never look at iTunes. B, they're probably not very funny. That's why they don't swear themselves. And they're actually kind of fibbing to you, for the lack of a better term. Because if you take any other genre besides business, where I don't think there's really a place to be swearing there, because most of your audience aren't going to expect that.
Yeah.
And they might want to use your materials for things at work or whatever. That's a genre where I can understand why there'd be no swearing. But in most other genres, your particular audience size is going to grow to a certain point. And a lot of the big podcasts about podcasting guys say, if you're clean, it can grow to an infinite size. But if you're a comedian and you just basically decide, okay, I want to get bigger, I'm going to stop swearing.
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be much correlation between your audience size growing and that not swearing.
Yeah.
But I can see that there might be an inverse relationship of everyone saying, okay, so he's not being himself at all, or she's not being herself at all on this particular podcast. So for the sake of being clean, to actually strip out of your particular show or the genre of your show what it is that genre is about, that to me doesn't equal audience growth. Now, I don't know if that makes sense, or it might be being a little esoteric, but most podcast genres are not going to punish you for swearing, but they are going to punish you for not being yourself and for having your guests basically not be themselves.
Yeah.
I've done it before on one of my music marketing shows, DIY Music Movement. I was the only clean show, pretty much in that whole genre, that's maintained week-to-week releases when I first released it. And I was following the podcast about podcasting advice that my audience will be infinitely bigger because it can't offend anybody. It pretty much offended every single rock and roller that knows that, A, if they know me personally for some reason, if they're from Australia and I've played with them, I do swear in day-to-day life.
Yeah.
And it also puts off anybody that knows that that's not the rock and roll world.
Yeah.
It's not what people talk like at festivals. It's not how fans communicate with each other. It's basically using a language that's alien to the genre for the sake of being clean, and to appeal to an audience that may never actually listen to my show anyway.
Yeah.
That to me just seems like absolute crap. And yeah, I can't really think of any other way to put it, but it's just bullshit. If anyone's telling you not to swear, I think it comes down really to their own personal ideology. They might have a personal issue against swearing, whether that's the environment they grew up in or the religious affiliation or whatever it happens to be. For whatever reason they don't like swearing, they basically are making that a blanket statement in podcasting that your show will be better off without swearing, when pretty much anything other than a radio program that's in the top charts in most of iTunes particularly, they all swear, and even the shows that are a bit softer have mild coarse language.
Yeah.
And that's as of today, in the middle of May 2014. I can't really find many shows in there that make a super massive effort to be clean, maybe outside of business and the children and family, whatever that genre is, where being clean has actually really helped them at all. Whereas I can see shows where they make an effort to not be themselves and their shows suck ass.
Yeah.
So that's the end of my soliloquy there. I might let you go for a bit now because I'm running out of breath.
Sure. Well, there's a recent episode of This American Life that I listened to on the podcast where they said, when we broadcast this on the radio, we took out the swear words, but we think it sounds better with the swear words in, and it did. It was, it was in context and it fit the tone of the whatever they were talking about. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I'm not, well, like you said, there's some people that they just don't like the swearing, but I just sort of don't understand it. Sort of, yeah, well, like you said, it sticks out to me more when it's not there. It's conspicuously absent, and that's so taking it out. I mean, if you're just not swearing, then fine. You don't have to force it in there, but also don't force it out of there.
Yeah,
just be yourself.
I guess where I was going, and the easiest way to explain my whole point, is if you're listening too much to people that have a certain feeling about language, and that's how you want to design your show, over the actual language and communication that you use, your friends use, your guests use, and most importantly, what your fans of your show use with each other, that's a massive contradiction to me.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of maybe keeping someone happy that reviews podcasts or sells consulting, that might have one certain ideological view on swearing, you're actually going to displace yourself from your audience. And it is a verbal medium. It's not like people are saying, he doesn't swear, but he wears crazy hats and he wears, Cannibal Corpse t-shirts, so he's cool.
Yeah.
It's basically all coming down to your voice and the words that you choose, and they really need to be in line with your audience. And I don't know much of the English-speaking world where even sophisticated people don't swear in day-to-day life.
Definitely.
So I'm not saying go out and swear. I mean, I don't want to come across like that because I've done a bunch of shows where I don't swear and some where I don't swear at all.
Yeah.
And it works. Just you really need to be mindful of your audience, not what some consultant feels about it for some ideological reason that might have nothing to do with creating quality programs whatsoever.
Yeah.
So I hope I'm not coming across too harsh there. I mean, I'm sure you'd be the first one to tell me.
No, well, I did a podcast, The Forgetting Curve, where it wasn't aimed at children, but it was sort of had a childlike feel about it. But some of the stuff I recorded from it had swearing in it, and I was so conflicted about, do I keep it in, do I leave it out? And I think I did keep some of the milder stuff in there, just because it was in the story, and that's the way it was.
I'll give you one good example for why I've had a change of heart about the language thing particularly, because I was recording mostly clean episodes of my main show, Braver by the Day. When I say main, I just mean the show that maybe, I've worked the hardest on and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I was predominantly clean, or it might have pretty much all been clean up until a point where I interviewed a guy called Elliot Hulse, who, granted, has a much bigger online profile. But he was himself.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't cut any swearing out of that, and he obviously realised, because I wasn't swearing heaps, that it wasn't the type of show where every second word was going to be the F word. But that was the most natural conversation that I've had with someone on my own podcast, because I knew that I could be 100% me and I wasn't censoring myself. I just chose not to swear very much in that particular interview. But if you're going to approach people like that and then you edit out everything that makes them them, because his audience would listen to that show purely to hear him. And if I basically either tell him I want it to be censored or go and edit everything out later so it is, you're not really getting that right person. Particularly if you're interviewing people, like you don't want to strip out everything that their fans are coming there for, because they're not really your fans yet. They're the fans of your guest. And I just think it's not really the right thing to do. And I'm probably going to be making a lot of enemies today, but yeah, I just don't give a crap, really. Once again. Yeah.
I think that's the best way to say it, really.
Yeah. So with all that said, Jackson, we might move on to something more lighthearted. What technology are we using today to produce this podcast?
Well, you and I are recording, our microphones are Sennheiser MD41s. We've got those running into a Soundcraft EFX12, which is then running into an M-Audio Fast Track Pro, which in turn is running into Logic Pro 9 on my MacBook Pro.
So just for anyone who isn't massively technically minded, Jackson just listed the microphone chain into the mixing desk into a digital interface for the computer, and then finally the software that he is choosing to use.
Good point.
Cool. So do you have a favourite podcast of the week that you've discovered, or is there anything you've been listening to, maybe an old show from an archive or something that you really like? Because I've actually been trying to go back through a lot of archives lately and really dig into different people's shows and see how their shows have changed over time.
Sure. Well, there was a recent comedy festival in Melbourne, and one of the acts I went to see has a podcast, which I've got into since then, and I've really enjoyed it, and that's the Little Dum Dum Club with Tommy Dassolo and Carl Chandler, and they just get on local comedians and chat about things.
Cool. I actually went and saw them live before I saw Will Anderson, who is one of Australia's big podcasters. So I watched a live podcast, and then I went and saw a guy who I know from a podcast. So
nice. Yeah,
that was pretty cool. My show is actually through Will Anderson once again, kind of Australia's podcast poster boy to a certain crowd, I guess. He was a guest on a show called Crab Feast.
Yeah.
And it's by Ryan Sickler and Jay Larson. And it's one of probably the funniest actual show I've ever heard. Like, a lot of podcasts are entertaining and they're funny or they're interesting, and they're run by comedians. This show was just straight up just joke after joke after joke. And it was just freaking hilarious. So yeah, that's my one. It's called Crab Feast. I'm sure a lot of people out there know about it. I just discovered it this week through, something Will Anderson said in passing about how dedicated the Crab Feast followers are. I think they call them feasters. And their audience apparently is ridiculously supportive. So if for no other reason you're still listening, if you wanted to go listen to how a show can garner an incredibly passionate audience, even more so than other comedy shows, Crab Feast might be interesting, even just to check out how they do stuff. Cool, mate. Well, what's your Twitter handle?
I'm OzPodcasts on Twitter.
OzPodcasts, and I'm at Joshua C. Liston. So, yes, all abuse can be sent that way. Or you can post it in, once again, to I Don't Give a Crap. Okay. And there's no PO box for that. So, yeah, I'm joking, obviously. So, thank you, everyone, for listening, and thanks for listening to my anger about the anti-profanity thing. I just think it's one of the most overblown things in podcasting. It's not even an issue. Just swear if you want and don't if you don't want.
Pretty much.
Cool, mate. I'll see you later.
We were just the warriors. We were just the warriors, home and away, fighting for a piece of you. Just a little moment slipping away.
Listen to Australian podcasts. ozpodcasts.com.au